Open the book of Revelation, and you find an entire prophetic atlas. Cities are named, rivers are named, kings, armies, and empires are placed on the map with startling precision. Babylon is named. Egypt is named. Israel, obviously, sits at the center of the whole story. Yet the one nation that currently prints the world's reserve currency, fields the largest military machine in human history, and exports its culture into almost every home on Earth is never mentioned. Not once. Not by name. Not by a thinly veiled title. Not even in a footnote. For a book this detailed, that silence is strange. And for 2,000 years, nobody had to think about it because the nation in question didn't exist yet. But for the last 2.5 centuries, as America has grown into the most dominant power on the planet, readers of Revelation have kept running into the same uncomfortable question. If the end-time story is truly global, where is she? There are really only 3 ways to answer that question. Bible scholars have argued for generations over which one is correct, and each one leads somewhere very different. Tonight we walk through all 3. The first explanation says America isn't missing at all. It's disguised. Revelation, this theory argues, doesn't need to say America because it's already describing her under an older, symbolic title, Babylon the Great, sometimes called Mystery Babylon. This isn't a modern invention. Preachers have floated versions of this idea since at least the 19th century, long before the United States held anything resembling global dominance. But the description in Revelation chapters 17 and 18 has only gotten harder to ignore as America's power has grown. Consider what the text actually says. In Revelation 17, this figure is described sitting on many waters, and a few verses later that image is explained directly. The waters represent peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. In other words, whatever this power is, its influence isn't regional. It touches everyone, everywhere, simultaneously. That's an unusual claim to make about any nation in the ancient world, where even the largest empires had hard geographic limits. It's a much easier claim to make about a country whose currency, media, and technology platforms genuinely do reach almost the entire globe today. The chapter continues with a description of extraordinary wealth: purple and scarlet clothing, gold, jewels, pearls. Revelation 18 goes further and actually itemizes a trade manifest: gold and silver, fine cloth and silk, rare timber and oil, livestock and transportation. And then, almost as an afterthought at the very bottom of the list, 2 final commodities: human bodies, described as slaves, and then simply souls of men. It's a chilling literary choice. Luxury goods stacked on top, human trafficking buried quietly underneath, as though the writer wanted readers to notice exactly what a wealthy trading empire tends to hide in its fine print. Then comes a detail that many casual readers skip past: the reaction to this power's downfall. It isn't soldiers who mourn her fall. It's merchants. It's sailors. It's, in the text's own words, everyone who works the sea for a living, standing at a distance and watching smoke rise from a burning city. That is a strange group of mourners to attach to a purely spiritual or purely political power. It's the kind of mourning you'd expect from people whose entire livelihood depended on a maritime trading economy, the kind built around ports, container ships, and global shipping lanes. If you wanted to describe a modern nation, this profile lines up in ways that are hard to dismiss outright. A country whose currency underwrites the global economy. A country whose ports move an almost unthinkable volume of goods every year. A country whose entertainment and technology exports shape the culture of nations that have never had a single American soldier on their soil. Revelation even uses the Greek word pharmakia to describe how this power deceives the nations, the root of our word pharmacy, a word that can mean drugs, potions, or, more broadly, anything that intoxicates a population into compliance. Whether you read that as literal medicine, mass media, or financial dependency, it's not a difficult leap to make toward a modern superpower. But there's a detail in the same passage that pushes hard against this whole theory, and honest teachers don't skip it. Revelation 17 verse 9 specifically says this woman sitteth upon 7 mountains. Nearly every scholar across church history, going back to the earliest church fathers, reads that line as an unmistakable reference to Rome, famously known throughout antiquity as the city built on 7 hills. America has no single capital built across 7 literal hills. That detail alone has kept the majority of serious commentators from ever fully embracing the American reading. And the disagreement runs even deeper than that one verse. The reformers Martin Luther and John Calvin both taught that Babylon represented Rome, or the corrupted institutional church of their day. Preterist scholars, who believe most of Revelation was already fulfilled in the 1st century, argue Babylon was Jerusalem itself, judged in AD 70. Futurists split further still, some expecting a literal, rebuilt city of Babylon in modern Iraq, others expecting an unnamed global economic system that hasn't fully formed yet. That last option is worth pausing on because it isn't purely hypothetical. The historical city of Babylon, south of modern Baghdad, was partially rebuilt decades ago under Saddam Hussein, who inscribed his own name into the new bricks in open imitation of the ancient kings who once ruled there. Restoration work at the site, including its famous gate, has continued off and on since. Some futurist teachers see that as a small, physical seed of something much larger still to come. So, is America Mystery Babylon? The honest answer is that nobody can say with certainty. The parallels are real enough to take seriously. The 7 Hills detail is real, enough to keep the theory from ever becoming consensus. What's left is a genuinely open question, which is exactly why the second explanation exists. The second explanation requires no sudden judgment, no burning city, no dramatic single hour of collapse. It simply argues that by the time the final events of prophecy unfold, America has already faded, not destroyed, just diminished, the way every dominant power before her eventually has been. History doesn't offer many exceptions to this pattern, and it's worth walking through a few of them plainly. Rome called itself the Eternal City, and, for a while, most of the ancient world believed it. Rome dominated the known world for roughly 5 centuries. But historians don't point to a single battle as the cause of its fall. They point to a slow unraveling that began generations earlier. Currency debased to pay for endless wars, political offices bought and sold, borders stretched thinner than the treasury or the army could actually support. By the time barbarian forces deposed the last Western emperor in 476 AD, the empire had already been hollowed out from the inside for the better part of 3 centuries. The ending wasn't dramatic. It was almost anticlimactic, a teenage emperor quietly removed from a throne that had already lost most of its real power. Britain's decline moved much faster and much more publicly. As late as the middle of the 20th century, the British Empire still controlled territory across every inhabited continent. Then, in 1956, Egypt's president nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France responded with a joint military operation, and on the battlefield, it worked. The canal zone was retaken within days. But a run on the British pound and pressure from the United States forced a total and humiliating withdrawal almost immediately afterward. Britain discovered, essentially overnight, that military victory no longer mattered if the nation's finances depended on someone else's approval. Historians still point to that single event as the moment the British Empire's decline became undeniable, even though the empire had been weakening for years before it. The Soviet Union followed a similar script on an even faster timeline. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the USSR matched the United States missile for missile, tank for tank. But its economy was never built to sustain that level of military spending, and a long, draining war in Afghanistan only accelerated the strain. By the final weeks of 1991, an empire that had looked unshakable a decade earlier simply dissolved, with far less resistance than almost anyone outside the country expected. 3 empires. 3 different centuries. 3 completely different causes of death on the surface. And yet the underlying pattern is nearly identical every time. Overextension abroad, financial strain at home, and a widening gap between how powerful a nation still looks and how powerful it actually still is. It isn't hard to see the same warning signs echoed in America's current situation. The national debt has climbed to levels without real historical precedent, and the interest owed on that debt alone now competes with, and by some measures has already surpassed, the country's entire annual defense budget. American forces remain stationed across the globe in a way no empire in history has ever attempted to sustain, which is a remarkable show of strength on paper and an enormous financial and logistical burden underneath it. None of that guarantees collapse. But it's precisely the kind of gap between appearance and reality that preceded every prior empire's decline. This theory connects to a specific prophetic text as well. Ezekiel 38 describes a future coalition, commonly associated by many prophecy teachers with Russia, Iran, and a handful of regional allies, marching against Israel in the last days. When that invasion happens, the text says only one group responds, and their response is entirely verbal. Scripture calls them the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, and that group asks a single pointed question without ever lifting a weapon. Commentators disagree on exactly which nations Tarshish and its young lions represent: ancient Spain, historic Britain and her former colonies, or the broader Western world as a whole, but under nearly every reading, the strongest military ally Israel has today is conspicuously silent when the moment actually arrives. If America is still the world's dominant military power at that point, that silence is very hard to explain. If America has already faded into a secondary role by then, the silence makes perfect sense. The third explanation doesn't require America to be destroyed, and it doesn't require her to decline either. It argues the entire question is built on a wrong assumption, that prophecy is primarily about nations at all, rather than about the spiritual condition of the people living inside them. When Jesus' disciples ask him privately what the sign of his return will be, in Matthew chapter 24, most readers jump straight to what follows: wars, famines, earthquakes. But that's not actually where Jesus starts. His very first sentence is a warning about deception. Take heed that no man deceive you. Before a single sign of judgment is described, Jesus warns his own followers to watch themselves first, not the headlines. He returns to that same warning a few verses later, saying that many false teachers will rise and deceive large numbers of people, and that because of increasing lawlessness, the love of many shall wax cold. That phrase isn't describing outsiders rejecting faith loudly and publicly. It's describing something happening quietly inside the church itself. Love simply cooling, generation by generation, so gradually that almost nobody notices the temperature dropping until it's already gone. Paul describes the same era in his letters, warning that in the last days people will hold a form of godliness while denying its actual power. In other words, all the outward vocabulary and structure of faith, with none of the substance behind it. And there's one passage in Revelation that speaks to this condition more directly than any other: the final letter Jesus dictates to the 7 churches of Asia, addressed to the church at Laodicea. Every other church on that list receives some mixture of praise and correction. Laodicea receives almost none of the former. Jesus tells them plainly that he knows their works, that they are neither cold nor hot, and that he wishes they were one or the other, because their lukewarmness makes him want to spit them out of his mouth entirely. It's the harshest single rebuke in all 7 letters, and it isn't aimed at persecution, poverty, or false doctrine from outside. It's aimed at comfortable self-satisfaction from within. Jesus explains exactly why that condition is so dangerous in the very next verse. The Laodicean church believed itself wealthy, secure, and in need of nothing, and Jesus tells them the opposite is true. They were, in his words, wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked, without any awareness of it at all. Historically, Laodicea really was one of the wealthiest banking centers in the region, famous for fine wool and a renowned eye salve. After a major earthquake, the city rebuilt itself without accepting outside aid, proud of its own self-sufficiency. Jesus answers each of those civic boasts with its exact spiritual opposite: rich yet poor, famous for wool yet naked, famous for treating eyes yet blind. The very things the city was proudest of became the precise measure of what it couldn't see about itself. That's the real danger this theory points to. A nation can be wealthy. It can be powerful. It can even be full of churches, full of Bibles, full of religious language on its currency and in its holidays, and still be spiritually absent from the actual story God is telling, simply because comfort has replaced conviction. Jesus makes the same point using a different image just 2 chapters earlier in Matthew, comparing the last days to the days of Noah, when people were eating, drinking, and marrying right up until the flood arrived without warning. It wasn't chaos that blinded that generation.
It was ordinary life.
None of these 3 explanations cancel each other out completely, and serious scholars land on different sides depending on how they read the Seven Hills detail, the historical parallels, or the warning to Laodicea. Maybe America is Babylon, judged suddenly in a single hour, as Revelation 18 describes 3 separate times. Maybe America simply follows Rome, Britain, and the Soviet Union down the same slow, well-worn path every dominant power eventually walks. Or maybe the entire question of geography misses the point, and the real absence being described was never about a nation on a map at all. What's notable is that every one of these 3 explanations ends in the exact same place. Paul tells the Corinthian church to examine themselves, to prove their own faith rather than measure it against everyone else in the room. Jesus tells his disciples that his own words will be the standard people are judged by on the last day. Not comfort, not certainty, not how good things currently look on the outside. Whichever theory turns out to be correct, that instruction doesn't change. It applies if America is Babylon. It applies if America simply fades the way every empire before her eventually has. And it applies most of all if the real danger was never a nation's fate at all, but the quiet, comfortable state of the heart inside it.